Hello there, my name is Eiler, and I'm going to give you an introduction to privacy by design. So, just some legal notice before I start that this presentation is provided just for informational purposes. It's not legal advice, I'm not a lawyer, and your requirements will be different from other people's requirements. We strongly encourage you to get your own legal advice on how to implement privacy and data protection and to understand which laws apply to you and any other requirements relevant to your business. So that's from the lawyers. So let's continue. So we have several learning objectives. It's to understand the difference between privacy regulations versus standards versus principles, understand who has responsibility for privacy management on AWS, and how to be a responsible data custodian for the data you're collecting of your subjects. And third, to understand how to implement controls, manage your risks, and how to test how effective those are. So what is privacy by design? So privacy by design is a set of principles which can be applied throughout your organization. And this includes information technology, which will be our focus for today, but also includes your business practices, includes the processes you have within your organization. It may include the physical design of your offices, your workplace, and also includes all of the network infrastructure that you have within your organization. Privacy by design has 7 foundational principles. First is that privacy and the controls around it should be proactive and not reactive, preventative and not remedial. What I mean by that is that, for example, if you're collecting data, that you should only collect the data you need to in order to serve the customer. You shouldn't have to then worry about data that you collected, which is too great in nature, is irrelevant to the purpose of why you're collecting data. Second of all, privacy should be a default for the data subject, for the person whose data you've collected. They should not have to take any action in order to maintain their privacy. Privacy should be the standard operating model. Third of all is that privacy should be embedded into the design, into the architecture, so that it is not something that is tacked on at the end. It is not something which is an afterthought, but rather it should be part of the architecture which you've created for data collection, data processing, and data disposal. Privacy by design has a focus on full functionality. This should not be a tension of privacy versus usability or privacy versus security. It is not a zero-sum game where by adding privacy requirements into your operating model that you actually reduce the functionality or reduce the ability to serve your customer. Fifth, that privacy by design enforces an end-to-end lifecycle protection. So at the point of collection, you already are thinking about privacy, processing of data on behalf of your subjects, and ultimately disposal of that data should be taken into account. For data subjects, they should have visibility into what you have collected, why you're collecting it, and it also focuses on transparency. What are you going to do with the data you have collected? How are you handling it? Who are you giving it to? And seventh, that there should be an underlying respect for the data subject's privacy. Privacy by design is not a government regulation per se. It is a set of principles. It is not industry created standards. So, Amazon didn't make this up. It is not like PCI DSS, which is a card industry guideline around data protection. You cannot really get certified against privacy by design. It is not a rubber stamp. It is not a badge which you put on your website. Privacy by design is evolving, but it does not have versions. And privacy by design, as a set of high-level principles, does not specifically say, here's how to do privacy by design. It doesn't have a specific technical implementation. So we can't say, apply this control, and then you've done privacy by design. However, we do note that some regulations are now embedding these concepts of privacy by design. For example, the European Union's GDPR, which went live in 2018, has a focus on data protection by design and by default. So this encompasses some aspects or some concepts of privacy by design within the regulation itself. So I'd refer you to go look at that if you're interested. But remember that in this webinar, we will be talking about general principles, and we are not talking about specific legal obligations you might be facing. So let's talk about the relationship between you, the customer, and AWS in regards to data custodianship. So on AWS, data management is in your hands as the customer. You maintain full control of your own content and responsibility for configuring the access to different services and resources. Similarly, you're the person who chooses which region to place the content, which region to place the data which you've collected for your customer, and how to store that, whether it's encrypted, unencrypted, in a database, in an S3 bucket, or so on. And you also choose how your content is secured. I would refer you to go take a look at our data privacy FAQ. Check out the link below. So AWS has a concept called the shared responsibility model. You may have seen this before if you've worked in security. At the base, AWS provides security or compliance or privacy protection of the cloud. So we create the infrastructure, we create or manage the hardware, we manage the data centers, we create the services, and we make them available to you, the customer. For you, the customer, you have responsibility for your security, your compliance, and your privacy controls within the cloud environment which you have created on AWS. This includes things like networking, traffic protection, such as encryption, server-side encryption, storage of data at rest, the operating system which you're using within your EC2 instances, which services you have created, or which workloads, which applications you have chosen to place in the cloud, and ultimately customer data. So you will note from this that your decision to place data in the cloud is always your own decision. So where to start with privacy by design? So first of all, you have to understand where relevant data is within your environment. You have to do a discovery process. Then once you know how, why, and where data is being used in your environment, you then need to do an assessment of the required protection, or the required controls you need to put in place in order to manage your risk around that data. And then thirdly, you need to look at implementing these controls and making sure that they work effectively. So for the discovery phase, you have to understand, what does personal data look like? So personal data may take many forms, and what is considered personal data depends on a few things. Depends on the regulations which you are under, if that's GDPR, if it is PDPA, for example, if you're in Singapore, or whichever jurisdiction you're in. They may have different ideas of what is considered to be personal information. This may include names, addresses, It may include things like IP addresses, email address, session data, and so on and so forth. But again, as you have control over this, you have to decide what is considered PII, personally identifiable information or personal data, and then figure out where that exists within your environment. So in terms of your architecture, you need to also take a look how you're collecting data, how it enters your technical environment on the cloud. Look at which controls are in place around ingress of data. Look at which controls you have currently in terms of processing of data as well. Remember that privacy by design focuses on only use the data you need to do the job that you need to do to serve that customer. And so focus on things like the use limitation of that data. What purpose did you collect it for? Look at which controls you have in place and make sure that you're accountable and that you can understand who has access to that data when it's being processed. And also look at egress. So if you're handing data to a third party in order to do further processing, you have to understand how that egress or how that data is being transferred to that third party. And you also need to look at how that third party is managing that data, because your responsibility is to your data subject, the person whose data you've collected. Just because you hand it out to a third party, you're not absolving yourself of that responsibility. So typical questions we see on collection of data or data ingress, where did this data come from? How do we understand that this person has consented to have their data collected by you? And how do we track this over time? Many data protection laws actually allow for the withdrawal of consent. So if someone later on says, hey, I don't want you to have my data anymore, I withdraw my consent, you need a mechanism to actually track that and also to respond to this type of request. So you have to make sure that you're collecting only the data that you need to collect in order to give a service to that particular person. That is for two reasons. One is that it helps to protect you, the customer of AWS, and also helps to protect the data subject, because you are not collecting more data than you need to in order to serve the customer. The customer is protected because you only are collecting what you need. You're protected because you're not collecting data which could then you need to manage. So, benefits on both sides there. We also need to think about how correct the data is, what the data quality is like, and how to manage data integrity. And lastly, think about how are you protecting this data as it flows into your system. In terms of processing, these are also typical questions that we see that you may need to think about when you're processing data on behalf of individuals. So think about, for example, how long you need to retain the data. Many regulations specify that you should only retain the data for as long as necessary to provide a service. So then if a particular person chooses not to use your services in the future, you don't have a reason to have that data anymore, and you should get rid of it. You also need to think about collection of data and processing of data from different sources. For example, you may collect individual parts of information about an individual person, which put together would have a greater impact to that person if this information was lost. Think about removal as well, bearing in mind that people may choose to withdraw consent, or bearing in mind that people will not always be users of your platform. You have to start thinking about, okay, how do I remove individuals' data from a shared environment? Say, for example, a database containing many people's data, many individuals' data, How do I remove information about one user from that environment or one customer? Similarly, in things like backups, if you don't have a reason to maintain that particular individual's data because they're no longer your customer or because they withdrew consent, you have to think about mechanisms for removal of that data from your backups. Be careful also around logging. So particularly around debug logging. If you consider that if you're collecting IP addresses and those can be tied back into individuals, your firewall logs, for example, may be considered to be PII. If you have a mechanism for identifying which individual, say for example a login entry in your application, if say the same individual who's managing the firewalls also has access to your database, they could actually infer, yes, this individual has this particular IP address, and then you have concerns about, okay, how do I manage this data around firewalls? So when we look at egress, imagine also that you need consent from the customer to hand data on to third parties. This often takes the form of a terms and conditions when someone finally signs up to a website, but you need to make it clear to that person whose data you're collecting about who's going to have access to that data. And this may also have implications if you're handing data to someone who's in a different country. So you need to ensure that you have consent from the customer to hand data on to third parties. This may also have impacts to where the third party is. Some countries have strict requirements about how and where you can place personally identifiable information or customer data. For example, you may need to have further consent in order to put that data somewhere else. You also need to think about data processing agreements and other vendor relationships that you have with that third party. They need to be able to show to you that they are handling personal data in a proper manner, because ultimately you are the person who's dealing with the person whose data you've collected. And so sending that data on to a third party does not absolve you of that responsibility you have to data protection. So as a result of this, the data protection impact assessment should let you identify data workflows, where data is being collected, processed, transmitted, accessed. This will then allow you to implement privacy by design concepts in those workflows as technical and operational controls. So these may take the form of things like data minimization, ensuring that you have the least privilege of access to those customer data or personal data, that you have a management capability around the data lifecycle from collection, processing to disposal, to also ensure the quality of the data you've collected. Many regulations include the capability for individuals to correct data, which is incorrect. You also have to track the consent of the individual, what consent they give or what purposes that they're giving you their data, and indeed how to protect that data throughout your environment. So how can AWS help with this? So we had mentioned before that the data responsibility is primarily in your hands as the customer. However, we do help in many different areas. So if you check our customer agreement, you'll see that we have terms and conditions around data privacy. So we state clearly about how we manage data. We also provide transparency to you, the customer, through our AWS Artifact service, where you can download our SOC 2 reports or other reports which outline how we're handling operations within our part of the cloud, our security, our compliance of the cloud, that part which is our responsibility. We provide you with a wide range of tools and services, which I'll go into now. And we also work with partners to help give you access to tools within the cloud. Using our AWS Marketplace, you have access to many different world-class services and products which help you manage things like data quality, data governance, and you can use these without having to build a separate relationship with those partners. You can use those services and they will go into your AWS bill. We also provide consulting expertise from our professional services team, of which I'm a member. And you may also refer to our independent audits. Again, from the AWS Artifact Service, you can review these third-party audits of our platform, of our operations, and you can use these as a basis to reply to data protection organizations, to your regulator, in order to build a full story about how you're managing data protection and privacy by design in the cloud environment. So let's look at some different AWS services which are relevant to privacy by design and services which help you implement the necessary controls and help you mitigate your risk. This is not an exhaustive list, but I would like to go through several different areas and just highlight some particular services which will be a benefit to you. So looking first at identity and access management. These help to answer typical questions that people have around data protection. So how do I control who has access to data? How do I ensure that strong authentication, such as multi-factor or hardware tokens, SMS, one-time passwords, are in place when I have individuals accessing personal data? And how do I manage people who are changing environments, who may be leaving the organization? So AWS IAM service, Identity and Access Management, is the bedrock of how we control access to cloud resources. This is the service which controls who has the ability to create resources, alter resources, or delete resources, things like S3 buckets, databases, and so on, within the AWS environment. However, beyond that, we also have things like our Managed Active Directory service, which allows you to set up single sign-on within the cloud for things like Windows workspaces, EC2 instances running Windows, and indeed even things like Linux can also authenticate against Active Directory. We also provide federation with your corporate single sign-on so that you do not need to have a separate set of sign-in details or credentials within the cloud. This way that if you have, say, for example, someone leaving the organization, you disable their access within your corporate environment and they immediately would lose access to the cloud as well. So we also see different mechanisms within the cloud. For example, many people do have different accounts for different purposes. Example would be that you have an account for production. You have a separate account for staging. You have a separate account for security purposes. You have a separate account for backup. However, you do not want to have 4 different sets of credentials for that access. And so we provide multi-account authentication. And this is one way that we can control access from a centralized point. So moving on, let's look towards monitoring and logging. So as data enters and is processed within your environment, you have to understand what is going on with that data, who has been accessing it, what operating activities are occurring, and whether anything strange has happened. So for this, we have a trio of different services. AWS CloudTrail, which is used to audit and review changes to the resources within the cloud environment. So when you create an S3 bucket, for example, that will be recorded in CloudTrail. Or if you change the policy on a bucket. AWS Config is also something that I would recommend you take a look at. This allows you to manage compliance and also to track resource change over time. And CloudWatch is used for operational logging, both of the cloud environment itself and also for systems and applications that you put into the cloud. So you can send your application logs to CloudWatch. So typical questions we have: am I compliant or not with my necessary regulations? What changes are being made? And what do I need to think about in terms of operational metrics? So CloudTrail is a service which we provide for auditing change within the environment. From changes you're making through the management console, through the command line interface, or through applications which you have created or using to alter the environment, you are creating resources through the self-service that is the cloud. CloudTrail picks up on that and allows you to identify change which you want to care about. Say, for example, someone changing a S3 bucket policy to allow public access. This may result in non-compliance for your privacy controls, and so these changes in CloudTrail can be sent to CloudWatch to help monitor and then alarm if you wish to respond to a change which is unexpected or unwanted. It can also be sent to S3 for archival purposes so that you can understand over time what is happening. So let's look also towards data protection. We provide a range of services, and again, I'd like to highlight just three for now. This is our AWS Key Management Service, KMS, our Cloud HSM, and our Certificate Manager. So in terms of management of encryption of data and at rest and in transit, we would say, okay, KMS for data at rest, and that uses industry standard encryption algorithms such as AES 256 with storage of the keys in a compliant manner. Also for data in transit, typically we see people using TLS, transport layer security, or also IPsec, which is used for VPN connections, virtual private networks. For certificates, which are used to authenticate your connection to the AWS environment, we provide AWS Certificate Manager. So take, for example, the privacy by design principle of secure by default or privacy as a default. We can apply encryption by default in many different resources and many different services within AWS. For example, here, we apply default encryption to S3 bucket so that any items uploaded into the bucket will be encrypted by default. Moving on, let's look also at our security and compliance controls that we can put in place. So I'd like to highlight again 3 services. This is not an exhaustive list, but 3 services that can assist you in applying privacy by design principles. So these help you answer the type of questions. How do I find out if something unusual is happening in my AWS account? How can I ensure that we have patched all of the systems, that we are secure? And where is our personally identifiable information stored within the environment? So I'd like to drill into Amazon Guard Duty. So this helps answer that first question. How do I figure out if something unusual is happening? Guard Duty is a threat detection platform. It looks at your environment on an ongoing basis, understands through machine learning what is normal and not normal within your environment, and then can flag or warn you if something unusual is happening. So it's anomaly detection. Another thing I would like to drill into is AWS Config. So I mentioned it within the monitoring and logging section, but it really does help you a lot within your cloud environment to enforce the idea of privacy as a default. So take, for example, this principle. We have then some directive controls which come out from the principle that say, okay, if privacy should be a default, then we should use default encryption to ensure that data is protected appropriately. And so we have this directive control. But how do we enforce this within the cloud environment? So we have mechanisms through the AWS Config service called config rules. Config rules are something which you can configure to look at certain resources within your environment. For example, here, S3 buckets. And we look in near real time at your environment and can identify any cases where your environment is not compliant with the particular rules you put in place. This rule is called S3 bucket service side encryption enabled. And as the label would suggest, this is about ensuring that you have encryption enabled. It's able to identify if you have non-compliant resources, but also is able to automatically remediate that non-compliance by changing the policies of the bucket. And this is an automated control. You do not need to take any action in order to regain compliance within your environment. The remediation actions are applied through our Systems Manager service, SSM, and can be written as code. The rules themselves, you can create your own rules within AWS Config. These can be written in a variety of languages. Essentially, it is a Lambda function. It's our serverless platform. And so you can write it in C#, you can write it in Java, in Node.js, in Python, so on and so forth. So you can actually use our existing managed rules, ones we provide for you, like this S3 bucket encryption rule. But you can also bring your own rules. And we also have open source rules. If you go check on GitHub, you will see that we have a large range of rules which have been created by our consultants, which will help you comply or to apply particular controls within your environment. I'd also like to highlight the different partners which we have, which focus on privacy, data governance, and data quality. There are many great partners out there with great services which go beyond what we provide as a default within the AWS cloud. And I'd encourage you to take a look at the capabilities these partners provide. You may also wish to check out AWS Professional Services. If you're an enterprise or if you are wanting to make good use of the AWS platform, of the AWS cloud, then consider professional services because our mission is to help build your confidence and your capability to adopt AWS cloud securely. So I myself, as I mentioned, am a member of the professional services team focused on data protection, privacy, security, and compliance. And we have consultants around the world which can help you directly to answer these questions which you may have around how do I protect data? How do I manage data securely? How do I comply with the requirements that I have within my organization? So to recap, we have this shared responsibility. Both yourself, our customer, and AWS have a hand in applying data protection principles within the AWS environment. So for compliance of the cloud, you may wish to refer to our AWS Artifact service that has all of the documentation you need to show your risk managers, your board, or your regulator about how we are managing your data on the cloud. And also, we provide a lot of services and capabilities to you to help you make sure that you have a compliant and secure environment. I'd also like to highlight DevSecOps. So bear in mind that all of your infrastructure in the cloud environment is software defined. When you provision a S3 bucket, we are not going out and putting in another disk in a server somewhere, but rather it is a software defined resource. And so software is code. So you have to remember also your infrastructure is also code. So we see a lot of benefit in using DevOps as a way to deliver our environments in AWS. So we use it extensively. And you may wish to also check out that as well. This also has a benefit when you're doing continuous integration, continuous deployment, such as CI/CD. You have a pipeline for delivery of code to your environment. But remember, as I said, your infrastructure is also code. And so you may wish to use a DevOps approach or a CI/CD pipeline in order to deliver that environment as well. DevSecOps is taking the concept of security guardrails or security checks and embedding them into your software development lifecycle so that you can actually pick up on insecure environments, insecure configurations before they actually enter your production environment. So take a look at that if you have time. There are plenty of other webinars out there around DevSecOps. So highly recommend go take a look at that. Also, yeah, take a look at our different APN partner. That's the AWS Partner Network. Bear in mind also that if you're trying something out, often there's a trial period. You maybe have free for a week or free for a month, for example. And you just pay as you use. You don't need to buy a one-year license up front. You can try something out. You don't like it, you just delete it and you're no longer paying for it. And you don't need to go sign a deal with that partner. It will all just go onto your AWS bill. So this allows you to evaluate very easily the different capabilities provided by our partners. So let's recap. Our outcomes was to help you understand the difference between regulations and standards. So as mentioned, privacy by design is a standard. It is a set of principles. It is not a regulation. I also hope by now you understand that responsibility for privacy management is a shared responsibility, but you are ultimately the person who decides which data you're going to place on AWS, and you have to consider how that data is being collected, processed, and egressed or handed out to third parties or ultimately deleted. And I hope by now this has helped you understand that AWS provides a various range of services and controls which you can use to manage your risk associated with privacy and how to test how effective and how to monitor how effective those controls are. So thank you very much, and we will now have some time for questions.